Welcome back to another episode of Modern Cyber, coming to you once again from the sidelines of Forward CloudSec. I always tell people this is actually one of the highlights of the year in the CloudSecurity calendar, because this is really a conference focused on practitioners and on deep research. So it's not a conference that's dominated by sponsored talks coming from different vendors who have a very particular biased view on things. Not to say that that's bad necessarily, but this is where you get to deal with, hear from people who have dealt with real world problems at scale. An example of that is somebody that we're going to talk to today, Jason Kao. Jason, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here. I'd love for you to start off just with a little bit about your background, maybe, where you're at right now, but also your journey into cloud security.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here. So a little bit about myself. I started off at Cisco as an engineer, went to Fidelity Investments, got into security, started building cloud security, ran a team there to build cloud security on Fidelity's initial migration to cloud. And that's how I got into cloud security. From there, I jumped to Praetorian, did offensive cloud security consulting across anywhere from Fortune 100s down or up, depending on how you see it, to startups. Yep. Then went to CloudQuery to run security research, as well as some of their solutions engineering. And then recently, I've started my own thing called FoxSecurity, working on specifically cloud data perimeters and preventing cloud ransomware.
Yeah. I want to come back to that ransomware topic and but that's quite a journey. And just as I mentioned in the beginning, like this is kind of the background of somebody who's been through the weeds, right? Who's dealt with scale, who's dealt with complexity, who's dealt with very high value environments with a lot of very valuable data that attackers would love to get their hands on.
Right.
And so I'm sure that journey has informed a lot of your thinking around where the real risks lie in terms of like, how do we protect our data? And there's something that you said that I think is very important to understand. And that is this, what are we really trying to protect when we're protecting cloud environments? Like for the most part, it's not the concept of protecting the environment itself. It's protecting the data inside the environment, right?
Right. And that's a really good point, right? Because one of the things I often think about, right, is, the talk that we're just talking about today, or some of the topics are related to identity and access management. So in this case, we, focused a lot and did a deep dive on AWS. One of the things that we see, right, is, okay, how do you explain risk to someone, right? Because if I say like, hey, I can create a new user who has administrator privileges within AWS, or I took some access keys and they have administrator access policy, which sounds foreign to a lot of people, right? What is the true impact?
Yeah.
I think part of it, right, is if you look at, your cloud environment, someone else's cloud environments, right, you may see an S3 bucket with sensitive data with PII in it, right? It could have, if you're looking at, hospital, where you could have, medical records, right? You could have financial information, right? You can store this in different databases, right? Yeah. And ultimately it's about protecting customers, protecting, even internal records, right? Yeah. And what is considered, things that are sensitive, or even, ancillary things that should be secured, right? So it could be infrastructure, it could be data in databases, data stores, right? It can even be access to those or anything related to those, right? And there are so many different attacks, so much great research comes out of this conference about how to secure those pieces.
Yeah. And so to that point, when you think about this concept of a data perimeter,
right?
I've had a lot of conversations with people in the past to try to explain cloud to them, just general terms, right? And you get a lot of the kind of misconceptions around like, oh, it's just somebody else's computer, and you also get the common misconceptions that it is by definition less secure, and people don't necessarily understand the shared responsibility model and everything that goes with it.
Right.
But in particular, this concept of a perimeter, I find, is often one that's really like mind-boggling for people who are coming from a more traditional network architecture background.
Right.
People, this one example use case of like, okay, in the days when I ran data centers for a couple of software companies that I worked at the time, let's imagine that I wanted to make one backup public to the internet. Right? Like that is really hard.
Right.
I've got my perimeter firewall, and then I've got my DMZ, and I've got my network address translation layer, and I've got my private IP addresses.
Right.
And by the way, like this backup thing is hanging off the back of the network. It's hitting on a separate LAN or a separate bus.
Right.
And then, within that backup, I've got like all these things that are private by default, and I want to make one of those things public.
Right.
Like that is a complicated network path and traversal that I would have to enable. But in the case of cloud, I can do it with, like two configurations.
Right.
And so like, where the perimeter lies, I think, is something that a lot of people don't understand necessarily as they make that transition to the cloud.
Right.
Even less so this data perimeter. So when you think about that concept, how do you explain a data perimeter to somebody?
Right. And I think that's a great example of using like what it may have looked like from an infrastructure perspective in the past, right? Because one of the things I think about is, it'd be like a scene straight from the movies, right? Is to break in or take some data, right? Someone have to break in your fortified data center, right? Yep. Get all the way through. They're like doing some dangling from the ceiling, right? And they steal a hard drive, right? And there's a lot of security around, right? And to that point, right, you know, it used to be a very like castle analogy is often used, right? And it's like everything within the castle is really hard to get to.
Yeah.
And to your point, right, it's like you said, right, there's two configuration items and something could be public. So the way I look at it is I use a different analogy here is imagine, you know, you have a house or apartment, right?
Okay.
And, you know, let's say the front door is typically the way in, right? And that's the outermost, or that you could even take it a step further and say you have a fence, right? Sure. Or let's say the front door, right? So the front door, if someone malicious actor is trying to get in, right, and they break through your front door, if you leave your crown jewels, right, your jewelry, right, maybe a stash of cash, right, your most important assets are like sentimental items, like right by the front door, the, you know, malicious actor gets in and just takes it right away.
Yeah.
Right. But, and that's, let's say the data from, they're very outside of your, like your infrastructure, right? But if, let's say you have it within, like, you know, not just the front door, but it's in your bedroom, there's another lock behind this like secret closet, right?
Yeah.
And then you have a safe in there that requires a separate combination, then that's where you're typically going to store your most important information, right? So you might store, or most important, like sentimental, you know, things, items, whether it's like a ring that's been passed down for generations, right? It might be a stack of money or, you know, something that means a lot of value, holds a lot of value for you.
Okay.
And that's one of the ways I look at data perimeters is like, you see the perimeters like the outside of the house, right? And then like the smaller perimeters inside, right, are like the safe, right? So, you know, if you have a roommate, for example, that, you know, you've met and, you know, you like them, you trust them, right? But not that much, right? You're not going to give them access to the safe, but they have an access, you know, access to your house, right?
Yeah.
So you can see that as like a different zone of trust, right?
Okay.
So I see that as like zones of trust, right? You're not going to give the public access to your house, but some people may have the code or your key to check on your animals or et cetera, but they may not have access into, let's say, the bedroom or, you know, your office or your eventually like the safe in your office, right? And that's how I see it as like these centers or these rings are zones of trust, and how to protect, right, what's most sensitive, right? So, you know, your spam mail that you get in the mail, right, that you get, you know, from catalogs, et cetera, right, you may not put those in that safe, right? But you would probably leave them, you know, inside your house and not outside, right?
Yeah. Okay. And so along those lines, to kind of extend the analogy a little bit, if you think about this, I think one of the things that is, again, not necessarily immediately obvious to people is like, you know, okay, I'm used to this castle and moat analogy coming from a traditional data center, and primarily like my moat consists of network access.
Exactly right.
But when I think about a data perimeter, it's probably a combination of network access and identity-based access to the environment, maybe coupled with something like, oh, I've got, you know, this AWS account, which represents one house, and another AWS account, which represents another house. So I've got a combination of like account plus network plus identity that might govern or like actually determine whether I do or do not have access to some piece of data, right?
Right. And that's spot on, right? I think one of the things that has been a shift is we're shifting away from these, you know, network perimeters, right? These network architectures, right? You mentioned a lot of them earlier, into a more identity focused world where, to your point, it's identity, right? Might be some networking, right? And there is also infrastructure like AWS accounts, right? And that whole conceptual piece of what is an account, right? What does IAM in AWS actually mean, right? Yep. You know, what has access, right? Is it like it's no longer a traditional database, right? It's, you know, you may have something on IAM, right? You may have an IAM role or principal, right? Or you may have, you know, the common example I'd give is, okay, these access keys were exposed, right? But who has access to them? How can they get in? What access they have, right? So it's this a little bit of a paradigm shift where identity is becoming like the new norm. And that is so much more focused on identity driving perimeters, right? And driving how to build successful security for protecting data.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that a little bit more, because I know the topic of your talk here at Forward CloudSec was around identity and access management, and how I love the title, something about how it's duplicitous.
Correct. Yeah. And it's a little bit of a play on words, right? Because duplicitous has multiple different meanings.
Yeah.
But the true reason, right, and it's a little bit tongue in cheek, is that there are IAM permissions, right, or different duplicate IAM permissions that can do the same thing.
Right.
And the common examples I would give, right, is looking at resources such as SQS, which is a little bit more technical, but a simple queue service.
Yeah.
And there's something in AWS called resource-based policies. And you can, you know, with these different permissions, right, there's multiple ways to grant access for someone to use your queue or access your queue.
Yeah. Okay. And so this duplicitous, it's kind of building on like the fact that, like you said, there's multiple ways that you can govern this access.
Right.
But I imagine that also presents multiple ways for people to get confused about who has access to what.
Right. And that's one of the difficulties of identity access management, right? Is the nuances of understanding what permissions are there and who has access.
Yep.
And some of the other examples we covered in the talk, right, is like, okay, well, let's say I protect this one permission, right? And in AWS that you can deny a permission so someone can't do that, right? Yeah. Is the other permission denied or not? Is there almost a backdoor or a different alternate way for someone to do what you don't want them to do, right? Yeah. If you're trying to secure it.
Yeah. And so is that again a case where like those other kind of boundaries, or those other, kind of perimeter constructs that we talked about, like the account structure and the network access, they would also come into play, or is this like primarily identity driven access?
So it's an interesting question, and let me see if I can understand it a little bit more, right? Is I think what a holistic IAM strategy, I think, requires understanding the infrastructure and how things are set up, right? So the accounts, right? The infrastructure you mentioned, right? Whether it's within, whether it's external, right? And then to that point, right, there are concepts in, AWS and also what you've seen with, some of the vendors out there is how do you build a perimeter with like organization, right? Which, is a set of accounts, right? How do you figure out who do you trust, right? Whether it's within your organization, as in like, hey, like you and I are in an organization and you have one account, I have one account, I probably will trust you. But if I've never met you before and I have no idea who you are and you have an account outside my organization, I may not trust you, right?
Sure.
So it's a question of what do you trust? How do you build the perimeter, right? And that factors into how we look at these duplicate IAM permissions, right? Because if it's something we trust, we create guardrails around it.
Yeah.
If someone does these actions, right, we can maybe just allow them, but monitor for make sure people are doing what we intend.
Yeah.
But still at the same time, right, like ensure that we know what's going on in the environment too.
Yeah. I'm kind of curious about a couple other aspects of this. So if there's multiple ways for me to grant access or deny access, first of all, do you find that most organizations actually understand that there are potentially like overlapping or conflicting permissions?
That's a really good question. So one of the things I mentioned in the talk, and I think this rings true for me, is that I think there's an implied understanding that there's only one way of doing something, right?
Right.
So using S3 buckets as an example, right? S3 is a very common resource in AWS to store, let's say it's like a blob storage, right?
Yeah.
So typically, right, there's only one way to create a bucket, right? So the action in AWS is a little bit more technical, is S3 create bucket, right? And for example, to put a resource-based policy to grant access to someone else, right, is S3, put bucket policy, for example, right? So for those, we expect that if we block or we say we don't want anyone using put bucket policy and I block that permission, then there's no other way of doing it.
Okay.
So, taking a step back to your question about, okay, well, do people understand this? And I think there's an implied understanding that there's usually only one way to do things.
Yeah.
But because there are these, small examples of duplicate IAM permissions, and again, right, from a statistic perspective, there's almost over 18,000 IAM permissions today.
Yeah, you mentioned that in your talk, and I was like, holy crap.
Which is crazy, right?
Yeah.
That's a lot for someone to even understand, right?
Yeah.
Over, let's say, 200 plus services, right?
Yep.
So to understand every single action, right, and which ones are sensitive is very difficult, right? So these are, again, examples here and there, right? And the majority of them do not have duplicates, but the ones that do, right, it breaks our I think what I've built this mental model in my head about what IAM should look like, what I can expect. So when there are duplicate permissions, that sort of breaks that understanding I have of how do I ensure I can secure AWS IAM for like my AWS resources.
It brings to mind another question that I've always been kind of confused about is like, I think a lot of the times when people, well, let me step back. I've observed this behavior in some organizations. I'll be curious if you've seen the same, which is like, this natural tendency as people try to troubleshoot IAM is that like, okay, I can't access a thing. And that's why I start troubleshooting, right?
Right.
And I'm like, oh, okay, it's because of X. I don't have get permission or I don't have list permission or whatever the case may be.
Right.
And so I try to grant myself that if I have access to the IAM policy to then like, make that change.
Right.
And little by little, I test this additional permission, that additional permission. And at some point, I'm just like, screw it, give myself star permission. And like, let me just open up access to everything. Right.
Right.
And I think a lot of people fall into that trap because like troubleshooting the granular, like line by line to figure out what is the thing that is effectively blocking you.
Right.
It is really complicated. Right.
Right.
And so like, I'm curious if you think about like, the fact that there are two ways that something could be allowed or something could be denied in certain cases, do you think people generally like care to understand what is the specific reason that allowed me access, or they care more of what is the specific thing that denied me access?
It's interesting, right? Because I think to me, it depends on how someone approaches building it. If they're looking at like, okay, what permissions do I need from a security perspective to do what I need to do with this application? Or they may be just looking for like the allows. But to your point, right? If they're iterating and they're putting application first, which is common, right? Because it's a new paradigm, right? When people didn't have to configure IAM infrastructure, right, et cetera, for all their applications, an application developer didn't have to worry about this, right? Yeah. And now they're trying to figure out like, okay, right, I may have a deadline to hit, right? I'm trying to get this feature that adds a lot of business value. How do I make sure I'm focusing on building this? And like, if I hit the deny, right, to your point, they could do one permission, right? And it may not, that takes a lot of time, right?
Yeah.
It's frustrating. I've dealt with that myself. Yeah. And then to your point, it's like, okay, added star, everything worked, but like, now do I sit there and spend the extra time to pull permissions away to get the exact quote unquote least privilege, which is very complicated.
Yeah. And I just think like a lot of organizations ultimately don't.
Right.
Like they end up kind of getting to some level of frustration, and then they end up doing star, and to your point, like they never really peel it back.
Right.
It's this very complex kind of balancing act where, especially during, let's say, like, test development staging phases before something goes into production.
Right.
It's generally much more permissible and allowed. And it's like, I don't really care if Jason has star permissions. Dress dev, like, I care about once it gets to prod.
Right.
But if I then don't know what permissions are actually required from a quote unquote least privilege perspective when I get to production, like that's actually a bad thing, right?
Right. And I think to add to that is, it made me think of this, right, is people could have different types of like responsibilities, right? So there could be one application team that does everything soup to nuts, right? They own the IAM, they own the infrastructure, right? And they might care a little bit more. And you could have organizations where an app team doesn't, and someone else will do the IAM for them, right? And then there's a disconnect of what are the true permissions that I may need to put that in, to put this application in and not break things, right?
Yeah.
And it's to your point, it's a very hard balancing act of how do I get to least privilege, but also make sure I'm building an application properly, right?
Yeah.
And then, to that point, it's not only like, if we dive in the weeds, it's not just an action. It's like, okay, what resources it access? Are you putting condition keys on there, right? And how does the security team ensure that these are done well enough, right, to prevent, it may not need to be perfectly least privileged, but good enough where all, the security holes that should be plugged are plugged.
Yeah. So picking back up on this thread, I once saw a chart that was like, actually the flow chart of IAM evaluations to understand like if something was going to be allowed or denied. It was some ridiculous like 27 step flow chart and all the different things that come over it. And it's like, is there an account boundary? Is there a service control policy?
Right.
Locking, like all of these things that factor in at various points. And I found it like, I feel like I'm somebody who knows cloud a little bit.
Right.
Been working in the cloud since 2010. Fun fact, IAM was introduced while I was working at AWS.
Wow.
So I actually got to meet with the early product team that designed it. And, nobody at the time could have had, I think, an idea of how complex it was going to get over time.
Right.
But, even as somebody who's been there for a lot of the journey and has seen IAM evolve, like I find it impossible to follow the logic of this thing. Like, unless I'm really taking the time to go granularly, step by step.
Right.
It's pretty bonkers.
Right. I know exactly what you're talking about. That flow chart, right? If you pull it up, it doesn't even fit on a slide deck, right? It's like to your point, it's like, okay, service control policies, resource control policies. Okay. Is there an allows or deny, right? Is there, attached IAM policy? What about resource-based policies?
Yeah.
What type of principle are you using?
Yeah.
Right. And it goes down the list, and it's a beautiful system by AWS, and it works very well. But it's very hard to understand.
Incredibly fast too, by the way. Like, I think that's one of the things that I took away from actually like looking at that chart afterwards. I was like, all of this calculation is happening in, like not what's smaller than a millisecond.
Right.
Is that a nanosecond? I don't know, but like tiny fraction of time.
Right.
So small that I don't really even perceive it when I'm making my S3 bucket object request. Right.
Right. Exactly. Right. And, manually, it takes me like 15 minutes to even figure it out, like
navigate that chart for one decision.
Right.
Yeah. And this is happening billions of times per minute across the internet. Yeah. I'm kind of curious, the background on the research for your talk today that helped you uncover the fact that there are like some of these conflicting permission sets. Like, what led you to go down this path?
It's a good question. So I think it's not a very exciting story. I was actually, I think I was working with or doing a project or helping a team out, and was looking at permissions because I was looking at, okay, like, one of the things we're trying to help this team do is probably do least privilege or figure out exactly what permissions they had.
Yeah.
And while flipping through these, right, I think, working with app teams, right, like trying to figure out what API calls they're using, what AWS infrastructure, right, and realizing that I don't know exactly what service it was, but realize there are multiple permissions, right?
Yeah.
And then looking through, because to your point, right, part of it is like, okay, how do I create boundaries or effective boundaries for people to experiment with, right?
Yeah.
Is what permissions do I not want people to have, right?
Yeah.
From a deny perspective, and realizing that there are multiple different ways to do something, started, leading me down this path.
Okay.
And we expanded a little bit, right? Again, there's over 18,000 permissions, so we didn't cover all of them.
Yeah.
But trying to cherry pick and single out the ones that we think could have a lot of impact.
Yeah.
And then again, from a historical perspective, see what influenced the design choices, right? Because, I think it was fantastic about developing new services, right? And to your point, it's wild to think about the scale of IAM and how it covers all these permissions, all these requests, right? But where do these inconsistencies come into play that could make securing IAM a little bit more complex than what it is today?
Yeah. I'm curious about a couple things, like from your own experience and your own perspective on this. Like, again, as somebody who's like, showing my age, a little bit older school, and comes from the kind of castle and moat network,
right.
Like as a guiding concept that I learned early in my career, and it's kind of formative to a lot of my thinking around security. I've since managed to kind of change some of my thinking about it. But there's a couple things that have always kind of come to my mind. And one is, like, generally speaking, in cyber hygiene, one of the guiding principles is like, the less stuff you have to manage, the better.
Right.
And so the more stuff you can just kind of like turn off and walk away from, the better. And in fact, like, the worst breach I ever experienced in my career is when we were using a piece of outdated technology that honestly should have been retired, and we didn't for whatever reason.
Right.
But like, to that point, okay, out of these 18,000 permissions, like, my organization needs probably a couple hundred. How do I like disable the other 17,500, right?
Right. And it's a good question, right? Because I think part of it is, there are features available. So it's interesting, right? If we think about different, again, this makes it complicated, right? Is the different levels within an AWS account, right? Or like your infrastructure resource, right? So you could have, settings at the organization level, which is like multiple accounts, right? So you could have, service control policies that say like, I want to, deny everyone from using some AWS service, right? You can block it there so no one can use that, right? Or like, I have a resource control policy that I don't want anyone outside of my direct organization accessing my S3 buckets or decrypting data, right? But then you get down to like accounts, right? Then you get down to, okay, the resource, which has a resource-based policy, and, different levels of things or settings that affect what you have, right?
Yeah.
That is very different from the castle and moat perspective or description, right? So I think, again, right, there are ways of disabling, to answer your question, there are ways of disabling the other service you don't need.
Yeah.
But then a question is like, well, what if you don't know what services you need or will need in the future, right?
Yeah.
And that goes back to like, now I need to think of doing the security work as almost a development team and work alongside and figure out, how do I iterate, right? Like, okay, I disabled this service in the past, or don't think people should use it, but it's in reality, it's a dependent service that is needed by something else, right?
Yeah.
And then figuring out, like, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say those dependencies are actually, I think, one of the things that I think would catch a lot of people out, right? It's like, so, in my talk today, we were talking about logging LLM interaction. Right. One of the things you discover from the log files is that actually, like, I think I'm using Bedrock, but what's actually firing behind the scenes is Lambda.
Right.
And so if you don't have Lambda turned on, then like, Bedrock's not going to work for you, right?
Right.
And I think that's an interesting thing, because another principle that, like, I learned early on in my career from a cybersecurity perspective is like, actually you start with a denial,
right? And
then you like selectively turn things on that you want.
Right.
And I think a lot of customers would probably think, why don't I just bring that same approach to AWS? And I say, well, I'm a relatively simple organization, and I need PC2 and EBS and S3, and, I need some VPC for networking, and I need data ingress and egress and ingress. And I need IAM because I need some users. But like, honestly, let me turn off everything else. Like, I'm not using RDS. Let me turn it off. I'm not using DynamoDB. Let me just hard deny access to all of those things. Do you find that organizations have that kind of approach or not so much?
So I've seen a mix of both, right? I think, if it's a very narrow use case, and I think, a lot of the applications are very similar in, I think, design and architecture, then potentially makes sense to do that.
Yeah.
But I think, part of, I think, the beauty of the cloud is experimentation of having, a cloud provider such as Amazon provide all these different services that solve for different use cases, right?
Yeah.
So, you may first use EC2 and self-host everything on EC2, but then it's like, okay, well, why not use a managed service that could do that, right? Let me expand to RDS, let me expand to DynamoDB, right? And then I think, so then you have to think about okay, well, what services do I expand and add to my, pull out of my deny list?
Yeah.
I think I've seen it both ways, right? Some will start with, potentially saying, here's my allow list of services. To your point, it could be a list of 7, it could be a list of 8, right?
Yeah.
And I'll slowly expand past that. Or some, I've seen it where organizations will look for specific permissions and services, say, okay, we definitely don't want anyone using these first, and starting with more of a allow but deny these specific things versus here's this smaller playground. So I think both work depending on what they're trying to do in this, how they iterate.
Yeah.
And I don't have a fully formed opinion yet on which one I prefer, because there are no downsides and benefits to both of those, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, if I said I turned off Lambda because we don't use it, but then I can't use Bedrock as a result of it, that's also an unintended side effect that is going to stifle innovation.
Right.
So that's not a great outcome.
Right.
Interesting. From your talk today, you've got this duplicitous nature. We've got these kind of sometimes colliding things that overlap with each other in various circumstances. What are the takeaways though from this is, beyond the fact that A, it's complex, and B, there's some of this conflict, how does an organization navigate?
Right. And you took some of my bullet points away. I think the first couple of things I said was, AWS IAM is complex and duplicate permissions do exist to make it hard.
Yeah.
And I think, to your point, it's very hard to manage AWS IAM. But I think having a good strategy in place, and this sounds very generic, but having a good strategy of doing an identity perimeter, a data perimeter, right, using these larger controls that AWS provides, helps us that if we even do seize or come across these duplicate permissions, right, we have protections against them, right?
Okay.
And I think part of it is, if you go look for the needle in the haystack and go through all 18,000 permissions, right? And some of them do really, some of them are a little bit more sensitive than others.
Yeah.
But I think overall, right, having this multi-layered security approach, right, of looking at my organizations, I'm looking at overall who has access, building these perimeters, right, with these organizational policies, right? And to your point, right, maybe I just say okay, here are the services I really want, right, I really care about, right? And if it includes Bedrock and Lambda, then sure, I'll add those in, right?
Yeah.
And then trying to create an understanding of the true security implications of those, and then holistically securing it, not only from an IAM perspective, but from detection, right, prevention, right, responding, things like that too.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Jason, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today to talk through this and, through your own journey and some of the lessons learned along the way. Yeah. Any last thoughts you want to share with our audience?
No, I think, I really appreciate the questioning, the questions, I should say. I really appreciate chatting with you and learning about your talk as well. I think, some of the takeaways is, I think my favorite part of this conference was just sitting in the hallway and or even at lunch or breakfast, right? And just chatting with other security practitioners who are truly passionate about security and learning about what they do.
Yeah.
So
couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I think in the intro yesterday, one of the things that Aaron, who gave the intro, said is you're in this place with 300 of the top cloud security practitioners in the world.
Right.
So no better place to interchange and debate and dialogue with people who have faced some of these hairy problems at scale with complexity,
right,
with sensitive data and all these things to have to kind of consider.
Right.
And by the way, balance that with innovation, enabling the organization to move forward. Right. So people who have faced similar challenges. So awesome. Well, Jason Kao, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Modern Cyber. For people who want to learn more, we will post a link to your talk. The YouTube will be up by the time this goes live. So we'll get that link from the show notes. For people who want to learn more about your work, I think you said the name of the firm is FoxSecurity.
Correct. Yeah.
It's just foxsecurity.com.
FoxSecurity.io.
FoxSecurity.io. Okay. Awesome. We will have that linked as well. To our audience, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on this episode of Modern Cyber. We will talk to you next time.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Awesome.